Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our webcast with our founder and president, Helga Zepp LaRouche. It's April 1st, 2020, and we're clearly in the midst of one of the most profound crises in modern, certainly in modern history, with the combined effects of a financial system that's blowing out, and as well with the expanding pandemic of coronavirus. And it's clear that the old way of thinking no longer works. So, Helga, what's your assessment, especially with the situation in the United States seeming to be heading out of control?
Yes, it is an unprecedented crisis, and I think nobody of us has experienced anything like that in our lifetime. And maybe it was like that in the world wars, but it quickly is developing such a seriousness of the situation. And I think that reality dawns on some people belatedly, but it's unavoidable because the elements are that not only the coronavirus is hitting the United States and Europe, but it will really be extremely bad for the developing sector. And we will come to that in a second. But I think first to start with the United States, I think yesterday's White House coronavirus task force meeting, which was given by President Trump and his health advisors, Fauci and Birx, was really completely sober and sobering, because what they basically said is that if everything is being done right now, maybe the number of deaths can be reduced to 100,000 or 200,000, 240,000 people. But if things go wrong, it may be 1 to 2 million. And right now, it does not look that this is going to be an easy job, because if you look, for example, to situations like New York, New Jersey, where you have the hotspot, highest infection rate exponentially growing right now, it is quite desperate that despite Governor Cuomo trying to get sufficient ventilators for the expected outbreak, he said that he only was able to get 2,500 ventilators of the required ones in 2 weeks from now from China, but that he is lacking 15,000. Now, obviously, all the other states in the United States were in a bidding match to get ventilators until FEMA took it over and is now organizing it centrally. But if there are no ventilators, then ventilators are in the critical phase of the coronavirus infection, that which is life-saving. And if there are no ventilators, then these people will just die. So it is a very serious situation. It has unbelievable, for an industrialized country, unbelievable social consequences. For example, they let out the prisoners in Rikers prison. This is a very infamous or famous prison, and they are now, because they have no other place to go, hanging out in Penn Station, where they're being, they get food deliveries from the guardian angels. Then you have 114,000 homeless children in New York alone, who used to get meals in the schools. So you have all kinds of social consequences, which really show the underlying problem that the lack of infrastructure investment, the privatization and dismantling of the health system over the last decades, all of that is now really coming to a point of complete crisis. I mean, there are obviously incredible efforts being made to retool some of the industries. There's an air bridge which has been established with many planes from China and other Asian countries, 50 planes altogether. There was yesterday the first Russian airplane coming to the United States delivering medical support. So there is an incredible mobilization going on, but it is also very clear that this is a pandemic, and you will have mass unemployment. There are some people talking about that the unemployment in the United States may go up to 30%. So this is really an unbelievable crisis.
And Helga, you talk about the crisis affecting the United States and how desperate it is. What are we seeing now in countries like Africa? I mean, India's got a total lockdown. Indonesia is now in the midst of a developing or growing crisis. This is obviously much more profound than, much more dangerous, I would say, in the developing sector.
You know, if you think that that the United States is a very well industrialized country, or at least it used to be. If you go to Africa or the other developing areas of the world, or formerly supposedly developing, not so developing countries, it will be really very bad, because you have some countries like, you know, South Africa, Kenya, Lagos is completely overwhelmed already, where you don't have that kind of a health system, and you know, you have already infectious diseases, you have HIV infection, you have tuberculosis, you have famine, you have malnutrition, and you know, this is really a powder keg. Now, the head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, said that both in the United States and in Africa, the next 2 weeks will tell how bad the crisis will be. But you know, so far, you know, there is a certain delay factor because of the poor transport connections of the African continent to the rest of the world. It arrived relatively late, but now it's there. And you know, there is the absolute danger that this will spread. You have half of the world de facto locked down. I mean, that's incredible. You have India, a country of 1.3 billion people, in a lockdown. But you know, that obviously is relative, because you know, the many day workers, people who just work for a day's pay in big cities like Delhi, they are now all fleeing these big cities because they don't earn any money and they have absolutely no reserves. So you see these pictures where these poor people get on crowded buses, you know, where they are absolutely not in a position to keep social distance. And then they're trying to rush home to their rural areas. But, you know, there is no health system. And despite the fact that Prime Minister Modi had quite some success with the Clean India campaign and the Modi Care, where he tried to improve the healthcare system, naturally this is all not enough. And you have places like Jakarta in Indonesia, 10 million people, one city. Half of the people don't have access to clean water. And a similar situation is in many, many other developing countries, including Mexico, including Peru. So we are really looking at an unprecedented world crisis. And the danger is naturally that this will overwhelm the health systems, that there is not enough production possible. The winter, which is now developing in the southern hemisphere, will favor the spread of the virus. And you know, you really will probably see many million of people dying. And I think this makes very, very clear that we need urgently a completely different system. Nothing will be like it was before. And I think that we have to go into a mass mobilization internationally, which the Schiller Institute is already engaged in, to establish a new world economic order. And we have, you know, called for that for a very long time. But immediately in this situation, it requires a summit of the most important, powerful countries, China, Russia, India, the United States, and they have to establish a new system. What we need is a completely new system. All the rules of the liberal economy, of the neoliberal model, the cheap labor markets, the outsourcing, all of that has to be replaced. And it has to start with the immediate building of a world health system where a decent health system is being built up in every single country. And that must be the beginning of an industrial revolution for the whole world. Nothing short of that will do. And that means we need a new Bretton Woods system, a new credit system to finance that. And if you agree with that, then help us in this mobilization, because what is at stake is the life of many millions of people and maybe yourself.
Helga, over the last few days, President Trump had discussions with President Xi Jinping of China and President Putin of Russia. Do you see this as a positive step toward the idea of a summit? Because these are bilateral discussions, but so far we haven't seen a response to your call on the level needed.
No, I think it's a step in the right direction. You know, the fact that Trump and Xi Jinping re-established contact, that there were discussions between the health ministers, that the United States started to accept this air bridge, that he started to discuss, that Trump started to discuss with Putin. All of these things are very positive, but you know they fall short. Also, the proposal by the UNCTAD, the UN Organization for Trade, uh, who proposed to have 2.5 trillion for building up a health sector in the developing sector, is a right step in the right direction. 1 trillion is for debt write-off. 1 trillion is for special drawing rights from the IMF. 500 billion is for a World Health Marshall Plan. That is very positive. But when you count that, it's really still the proverbial peanuts, because to build up a world health system needs much, much more than $500 billion. That's for the whole developing countries. That's not just for one country, it's for the entire 180 or so, or I don't know how many developing countries are of those. But it's 170, 180 countries, and if you divide it, it's just not enough.
Well, and there's a lot of talk about the time lag in doing the emergency mobilization, getting the equipment and other things. To me, the real time lag is the almost 45 years since your husband first sounded the warning in 1974 that a shift in the financial system to a neoliberal colonial system, a new kind of colonial system, would lead to this kind of pandemic. People obviously weren't listening. The idea that there was no warning is completely false, isn't it?
Well, the first memorandum that the economic financial policies of the IMF and the World Bank would lead to pandemics, he issued in 1973. Then in 1974, he initiated a biological ecological Holocaust task force, which presented their findings of a study end of 74. And I was just rereading a report which he also initiated in 1984, 85, which is one of several large studies which absolutely predict why it would happen. Namely, that if you lower, first of all, there is a connection between the the biological sphere, the biosphere, and the economy. And if you lower the living standard and the energy of the system of the economic society, then lower forms of life of the biological area just take over. And he compared it at that time, and I think this is a very fitting image also for today. He said that the cheap labor orientation, towards the developing sector and the keeping the development down in the so-called third world has to be compared to Schachtian economics in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. He said a lot of deaths in the concentration camps came from forcing the people sitting in these camps to do hard labor. And they would have to do work for about 2,000 or 3,000 calories, but they would only get food for about 1,000 calories. And then it was a question of time when they just would die of overexhaustion. Now, that is a fitting image, because if you lower the living standard of the developing countries unnecessarily by denying them infrastructure, what the World Wildlife Fund did with all their campaigns to ruin the prospects for dams, for industrial development, just blocking development with the phony argument of ecologism. What you do then is you reduce the ability of people to withstand diseases, you lower their immune system, you make them susceptible to pandemics. And this is exactly what we see today. And that was clear. We discussed it in no uncertain terms. We said these policies would have more consequences than the genocide of Adolf Hitler. And I absolutely want to repeat that. When you see people today who are indifferent, who say, I don't care, what do I care about Africa, or what do I care about Latin America? These are people who are morally the equivalent of Nuremberg criminals. Because if you remember, at the Nuremberg trial, the judges said you either knew or you should have known about what was going on in the Third Reich. And concerning the condition of the developing sector, the exact same thing can be said. The people who are pushing no development, who are more concerned about a little snail in some corner than millions and millions of people, these are people who are criminal. And that criminality absolutely has to stop. We have to start rebuilding the world, and every life in Africa, in Latin America, and Asia is as precious as any child in Germany or in the United States or any other place. And I am consciously using this rather stark language, because this complacency and this arrogance of the Eurocentrists, or the America-centrists for that matter, it has to stop. We are at a point of moral and economic breakdown crisis of the whole world, and we need a new system, and that has to be mobilized, and it has to be gotten through, because if we don't do that, we are risking, our humanity, and either physically, because this is not yet clear if it doesn't lead to war as a consequence of under conditions of a breakdown crisis, or it leads to our moral demise. So I really think that we have to absolutely change this. We have to allow industrial development in every single country in the world, and we have to have a decent living standard. And it is very easy, because China has shown the way that you can bring infrastructure development as the precondition for development to every country. And it is up to us in the so-called Western countries, in European and in the United States, European countries and the United States, to absolutely change our ways.
I think it's also important, going back to Lin's warnings in the early 70s, that he identified individuals who actually were committed to population reduction, knowing this would happen. Now, we're seeing some of these same kind of comments. You had mentioned before people talking about, oh, isn't it wonderful, there are now blue skies. There are people who are cheering on the demise of the elderly and the so-called useless eaters, aren't there?
Well, there is the flagship magazine of the British Empire is just coming out with that line today, namely The Economist. They say, isn't it wonderful that the economy is coming to a grinding halt? No CO2 emissions. We just have to make sure that after this crisis is over, we are not going back to normal. And there are some other criminal people who call themselves economists, who also say, that if this crisis stops and is over, we have to rebuild the economy, and it has to be all based on climate protection. Now, we have discussed the reasons why the green ecology is exactly what caused this crisis. And if we would go back to the same policies which have caused this crisis, then we have clearly not the moral fitness to survive.
Now, Helga, you've been talking about the rebuilding of the whole world health system. You had a conference call yesterday morning with young people where you called on them to take responsibility for the organizing process to do this. Uh, what is your sense of the ability to mobilize youth today to take on this task?
Oh, I think this was very encouraging because this was the first such international youth calls. And, it was about 70, 75 young people from all over the world, from the United States, Mexico, Peru, Pakistan, Africa, Europe, China. And I think that the discussion really reflected that these young people are morally absolutely committed to make sure that they have a future, because the idea that every country has the right to have a decent health system is obvious, and they are committed to bring this message to a lot of other young people, to the universities. They are committed to spread it to other organizations, especially in the developing sector, and all of them are really tuned into the approach that you need the world leaders of the most important countries to change the system. And I think this is important because, people have not really thought about it. You cannot sit out this crisis. You cannot just wait until it's over, because, this is a pandemic and it may come back in waves. And it is intersected with the breakdown of the financial system, the collapse of the physical economy. And the only way you get out of that is you have to have a completely new system. Now, most people have not spent many thoughts on, that is either necessary or possible, or they say, you can't do that. Yes, you can do it. uh, Systems are man-made. They are not built in the physical universe. They are man-made, and you can change the system. If the old system is not suitable for the common good of the people, then it has to be replaced. And we have specified many times, what that must look like. You need global Glass-Steagall banking separation. You have to end the casino economy. You have to protect the commercial banks. You have to create a national bank in every country. You have to connect these national banks in a new Bretton Woods system, which provides cheap credit long-term for clearly defined development projects. And then you have to have international cooperation. And I think among the young people in particular, the idea that cooperation has to replace confrontation is a very easy to be understood idea. And there were several, especially young women, which made me especially happy because, I'm all for woman power. And they especially emphasized that the passion which needs to be mobilized for that is agape, and that, the change which has to occur must be based on the love for humanity. And in this discussion, you could, get a first inkling of what the kind of new system will be like, namely that the geopoliticians will be out. The people who think that you can start endless wars just to make profit, this is an obsolete idea of troglodytes, and that the future must belong to young people who organize the world in different ways in the interest of each country and vice versa. And that was actually a very hopeful call. And I would urge people to get in contact with us to see how they can join it.
Now, when you talk about troglodytes, look at what's going on in Europe with the European Union, the battles that are going on around the continuation of the neoliberal policies. This is in complete contrast to what you're discussing with the young people, complete absence of agape. Just catch us up a little bit on what's going on in the EU.
Well, it's almost a question of the past to talk about the EU, because it's really right now a big question mark how long this construct will remain in place. Because, there is no solidarity There is a big feud right now between Germany and Italy and France and the other southern European countries, because it's a little bit on a wrong issue, namely this issue of Euro bonds, which I think is not a good idea because it's still in the realm of banking bailout. Just to mention it in parentheses, the Federal Reserve just yesterday opened their repo credit facility to all other central banks. So that means basically they intend to help each other, to bail each other out. The Federal Reserve earlier had allocated 4 trillion for the bailout of the US banking sector, which was correctly characterized by the Republican Congressman Thomas Mathey as the biggest transfer of wealth from the ordinary people to the very rich and the bankers. So this is part of the Eurobond. So I'm not in favor of the Eurobond, but the conflict which has arisen between Germany and Holland and Austria on the one side and these other countries on the other side pertains to a real issue, and that is that obviously the countries of the south, especially Italy and Spain, and increasingly also France, are really suffering an incredible exponential growth rate of this virus. And they have demanded some finance mechanism organized by the EU, which was blocked by Germany in particular, and Holland and Austria. So what these countries are saying is that this is the ugly face of Europe. They say, if, the tone becomes quite nasty, for example, the Italian media and I think also Prime Minister Conte were saying that, if that would have been the attitude of the other European countries at the 1953 debt conference in London, where half of the German debt was forgiven, which obviously was an extremely important factor in the reconstruction of Germany after the Second World War. If that would not have done, then Germany would still live on the garbage piles. So the tone is becoming nasty, and everybody, Italy, Spain, Serbia, they all say that they got more help from China, from Russia, from Cuba. Even the small country of Albania was sending 30 health personnel to Italy to help. So you can really see who is your friend and who is completely, only motivated by other reasons. So this will remain. And, I think this anti-China campaign, which is coming from Pompeo, from the Foreign Affairs magazine, from the Council of Foreign Relations, who are still in this absolutely vicious campaign against China, I think that will, vanish, because people in this crisis see who is helping and who is not. So I think that the situation in Europe, maybe in a week or 2 weeks when we talk next time, the EU may not exist. And that's not a bad thing, because it was a bad construction from the very beginning. It could not work. And, it never existed. There is no European people. There are many nations and many cultures, but the European bureaucracy is an evil structure which is not in correspondence to the interest of their own members. And the sooner it is replaced by something else, either, a Eurasian economic alliance of sovereign states from the from the Chinese Sea, Vladivostok to Lisbon, or some other kind of new alliance of sovereign republics working together for a new world economic order. And that does not mean that European countries cannot work together, but they should not be under the tutelage of some supranational structure. So I think we will see big changes in this coming period, and it requires the active intervention of as many state citizens as possible. So please get in contact with us and help us to try to change the agenda on a large scale.
Toward accomplishing that goal, the Schiller Institute is going to have an international conference, April 24th and 25th. Just give us a little bit of a sense of what you hope to come out of that conference with.
Well, we had to shift that conference naturally, which was planned for some time to be an internet conference, because you can't have physical conferences at this point. But in that lies also an advantage, namely that you can reach much larger audiences, and therefore people should start to register for that conference, because then you will be also supplied with additional information and materials you can read ahead of time to be prepared to participate as a more active person in this conference. And what we will try to do is we will try to discuss the issues at that conference which we think should be taken up by these large governments. So we will try to, really inform the population on the needed changes in the strategic alliance, the needed cultural changes, the need to go to a cultural renaissance of classical art and classical music. We will discuss the frontiers of science, what is necessary to defeat not only the coronavirus, but to really get a completely different sense of space medicine, of breakthroughs in optical biophysics, in redefining what is life, what do we need to know to be able to combat such problems much better, and naturally what must be the principles of physical economy when we rebuild the world economy. So you should definitely get in touch with us, register for the conference, and be part of it.
And I would encourage everyone to join this mobilization with a very simple thing. Share this webcast, pass it around, get your friends to watch it, and then go to the Schiller Institute website, the LaRouche PAC website, and study these ideas, because it's these ideas that have been generated from Lyndon LaRouche back in the 60s and 70s that are not only valid, but they represent universal principles. And it's through a return to those kind of principles that we can restore mankind. So Helga, thank you very much for your comments and joining us today. And as you always say, hopefully we'll see you next week.
Yes, let's do something to move mankind in a better direction.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Bye-bye.